Welcome to the new online course, Regulating Global Supply Chains to Empower Workers. Our online courses over the past years have analyzed the structural problems behind the poor working conditions and violations of workers' rights in global supply chains. In this new course, we focus on a set of interrelated and mutually reinforcing policy proposals seeking to set in motion changes which, on the one hand, make global supply chains economically, socially, and environmentally more sustainable, and on the other, empower workers to push for those changes. Let's look at the first policy objective, towards a fair trade regime. A critical objective given that 1/3 to half of international trade goes through global supply chains. The significant power and development asymmetries between countries reflect the history of international trade, a history deeply intertwined with the history of colonialism and imperialism. The rule-making institutions such as the World Trade Organization, WTO, have worsened the existing asymmetries, contributing to a trade regime prone to crisis. The virtual standstill of trade negotiations at the WTO is but one of the expressions of this crisis. Another expression is the unlimited corporate power and intellectual property rights fundamentalism, whereby multinational corporations use the skewed system of international trade to enhance profits and keep their dominance by blocking the transfer of technology and know-how, which, ironically, is a promise of free trade advocates. This has proven to be a completely ineffective model in meeting the needs of a global health emergency such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Proposals and strategies towards a fair trade regime vary from challenging intellectual property rights and problematic clauses to adding environmental and social clauses to trade agreements.
Meanwhile, the pandemic has shown the importance of shortening global supply chains and of shifting the focus to regional trade, which may be more promising for the industrialization of developing countries. Trade unions need to build alliances with academics, trade specialists, and other progressive forces to mobilize for revising and/or blocking proposed trade agreements, which erode the space for development, including industrial policies for a green transition.
This brings us to the second policy objective, designing sustainable industrial policies. The current model of trade and global supply chains have shaped the industrial development of most developing countries. They were promised that integration in global supply chains would lead to industrial upgrading. In reality, most of them remain locked in the lower end of value chains, bearing the heaviest environmental burden of global consumption patterns. While developed countries made extensive use of protectionist policies to support domestic sectors and industrialize, trade rules of the last decades deny developing countries access to these same policies. Even the more recent historical evidence from South Korea and Taiwan shows that less developed countries are able to catch up only by pursuing a comprehensive industrial policy. Despite increasing constraints posed by the current trade and investment regime, countries still have some policy space to develop and strengthen their industrial policies. In particular, economic clusters can be used to ensure social and environmental upgrading. Transparency and active participation of trade unions is critical to all elements of this set of interventions. Finally, the environmental crisis requires a fundamental transformation of the growth model and gearing the industrial policy towards strengthening sectors related to life-supporting infrastructure.
Building a fair taxation regime is a key component of this policy package. In the current trade and global supply chains model, the multinationals are also empowered to shift profits and shop around for tax-free jurisdictions. Such practices push countries in a race to the bottom in tax rates, thus starving them of much-needed resources for public services and public policies, including industrial policy. They also put smaller companies in a massive disadvantage vis-à-vis corporations, thus undermining fair competition and eroding the space for meaningful collective bargaining. Driving political action for fair taxation requires exposing tax dodging practices and putting forward ambitious policy proposals such as a unitary tax, a global minimum tax of around 25%, and taxing tech giants. The Google tax applied in India illustrates the challenges of taxing such companies.
Regulating global supply chains requires also ensuring effective mandatory due diligence. For human rights mandatory due diligence to be effective, there is a need to focus on a number of issues, such as expanding the scope and coverage in terms of company size and tiers, ensuring that their workers know their rights, can make complaints, and institute grievance proceedings without fear of dismissal and access to remedy. Finally, effective human rights due diligence by companies underscores the critical importance of consultations with trade unions and other relevant stakeholders, and of public authorities in monitoring and levying sanctions on offending companies.
Achieving equitable purchasing contracts and practices is another important policy objective for regulating supply chains. The response of brands to the COVID-19 crisis, whereby they minimize losses by suspending or cancelling orders with suppliers worldwide, has exposed the significant power asymmetries between brands and suppliers. This power asymmetry is manifested in the purchasing contracts and practices. Adequate legal regulations are critical to ensure more equitable purchasing contracts and practices, which address the power asymmetries and distributional conflicts between the buyers and suppliers, as well as between suppliers and workers.
Finally, worker and trade union-driven social responsibility initiatives are critical to complement the rules at the global and national level. These negotiated solutions are more flexible and can be easily adapted to a particular country's context and/or supply chain. Among such initiatives, the Maritime Convention provides a framework for a negotiated global minimum wage, which can serve as a blueprint for similar global solutions. Similarly, global framework agreements with innovative elements in terms of scope, implementation, transparency, participation of people concerned, and arbitration provide an important path for transitioning from corporate social responsibility to worker and trade union social responsibility. Such negotiated binding agreements, however, require a supportive legal and policy environment which guarantees the effective application of the right to organize and bargain collectively. We look forward to discussing together these policy proposals in the following chapters. Join us.